Hey World Civilizations, Mr. Lassiter here, and in this video we're going to look at the Golden Age of Africa. Pretty much African history from the Bantu migrations up until about 1500. Let's look at our video goals. What were the major events that shaped pre-modern Africa? What was Africa's role in pre-modern trade? And here's a hint, it was very important. What did the political landscape of Africa look like leading up to European exploration? And what was the influence of Islam on certain regions of Africa? And hopefully, if you can answer all those questions, we will figure out what this picture on the right is. So first of all, if we look at pre-modern Africa, through our studies, especially focusing on the Mediterranean, I hope you understand that North Africa was extremely important, not only for being the home of the Egyptian civilization, but also being an important place during the Hellenistic age. The city of Alexandria was located in North Africa. Its importance continues through the Roman and Byzantine empires, and then of course during the rise of Islam and the spread of the Islamic caliphates. At the dawn of the modern era, North Africa is going to be dominated by Muslim kingdoms, although not those original Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates, and then later empires. The Ottoman Empire will have control basically by 1600. In sub-Saharan Africa, though, we see something different taking place. And we're going to go way back for this, back to about 1000 BCE. A series of migrations start, most likely because of environmental pressures or perhaps over-farming or changes in climate that lead a group of people known as the Bantu to leave their homeland in what is now pretty much present-day Nigeria and begin migrating throughout sub-Saharan Africa. This is done in waves. It's not done all at once, and it's done over about 2,000 years plus. So the Bantu migrations themselves, again, refer to a lot of different migrations. But in doing so, these Bantu people spread a lot of important things throughout Africa. One, they spread agriculture. Two, they spread iron making, which was a very advanced technology. They also spread their language and religious traditions across sub-Saharan Africa. And so we see, even though sub-Saharan Africa is extremely diverse, in some cases we see kind of commonalities in, for example, religious tradition or language in certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And we currently believe this is because of this kind of this original migration. Now, in looking at how Africa develops, it's really important to understand its role in trade in the world, especially regional trade and trade between regions. In the Mediterranean region, as you see in this image, North Africa had always traded with Europe and the Levant, or the Middle East. They usually traded in bulk items and luxury goods, but that Mediterranean trade. Beginning around the year 300, the camel saddle becomes invented, and camels become a very good tool for moving goods across deserts. We've talked about that before. And so a trade develops connecting North Africa, which is already trading in the Mediterranean, with sub-Saharan Africa, especially West Africa. And so we see a trade in goods of salt and textiles and luxury goods coming from North Africa to West Africa. And in exchange, West Africa begins exporting gold, ivory, and slaves in massive amounts, especially gold. With this exchange of goods, in a little bit we will see there's also going to be an exchange in ideas and religions. In the Indian Ocean, Africa plays a major role as well, especially along the eastern coast of Africa, which becomes known as the Swahili coast. Basically, East Africa becomes another leg on this massive trade network in the Indian Ocean. This Indian Ocean connected China to Southeast Asia, to India, to the Middle East, and East Africa played a vital role. East Africa was especially important for exporting things like ivory, gold, exotic animals, and slaves. In fact, there's a story of a Chinese merchant bringing back a giraffe from India to China as a gift for the Chinese emperor. But that giraffe did not originate in India. It was actually brought to India from trade with East Africa to be included in a king's basically zoo, and then was given as a gift from that king to the Chinese emperor. So goods are moving all around this region. Of course, languages are moving, religions are moving, ideas as well. But Africa is kind of this very central place where it's going to be connected to the Indian Ocean trade, be connected to the Middle East, and be connected to Europe. Now, one of the major exports that we see in Africa, not only in the Mediterranean or in the Trans-Saharan trade or in the Indian Ocean, is the export of slaves. Sub-Saharan Africa did trade in slaves, and slavery existed in Sub-Saharan Africa well before Europeans arrived. Europeans are going to take it to another level, though. For example, before Europeans arrived, slavery was not always hereditary. Usually it was not. And that means if your father was a slave, it does not necessarily mean that you would be born into slavery. And slaves are often used for a variety of work, depending on where slaves went. Women were usually sold into slavery as servants or concubines. Men became agricultural workers or soldiers in the military. We also have examples of men joining royal courts. And that was because owning slaves was more of a status symbol than anything. It was not necessarily something seen as an economic necessity. That will change when Europeans arrive and become involved in the slave trade. There is an already existing network to capture and sell slaves, and it will expand extremely rapidly. In this image, you see here a slave market in Khartoum in what is now Sudan. And this map shows generally the numbers of slaves that were traded around the world, pretty much between about 1450 and 1850. So a great number of slaves moving to the Americas, but the slave trade did actually continue in the Indian Ocean well into the 19th century. So Africa was a very important center for trade in the world, and that's something we see. But it also is important to understand that the political structures that developed in Africa were complex and had developed just like anywhere else in the world. In West Africa, for example, there are three major kingdoms or empires that emerged. The Ghana Empire first, then later the Mali Empire, which is extremely important, and then the Songhai Empire. And so all three of these empires are extremely important. The Mali Empire is of particular note because of its wealth and its conversion to Islam. So the leader of the Mali Empire at one point converts to Islam. Another leader, a guy named Mansa Musa, who was that actually first picture you saw today, goes on a pilgrimage to Mecca and brings massive amounts of gold with them, something like 70 camels just loaded down with gold. It causes the economy of Egypt to collapse when he just gives out gold to people on the streets as part of his charity. But everybody's like, ooh, this Mali Empire, super rich. We want to trade with them. So it actually spurs on more trade and the spread of ideas between West Africa and North Africa in the Middle East. In North Africa, of course, as I showed you that map earlier, Islamic kingdoms and empires would dominate that region. In East Africa, we see the development of independent city-states, for the most part independent city-states, that are very much engaged in trade in the Indian Ocean. There's also a kingdom, as you see here on the map, in East Africa known as Ethiopia, which is kind of an island of Christianity in East Africa, and it will remain an empire for a long time and kind of remains independent for a great while. In fact, it's one of two places in Africa that is not colonized in the 1800s by Europeans. Elsewhere, we see other kingdoms develop in sub-Saharan Africa. Here you see the Kingdom of Congo, which we'll bring up in class. Great Zimbabwe, a kingdom in southern Africa. So there are a lot of these kingdoms popping up, and a lot of them will interact with Europeans or interacting in trade already with other groups of people. Now you have trade, you have political entities. Of course, the one thing we really have left out is culture here. And as I talked about earlier, we saw the spread of Bantu culture with the Bantu migrations. The Swahili language, or what will become the Swahili language, I should say, spreads throughout sub-Saharan Africa and then morphs into the thousands of dialects found and different languages found in sub-Saharan Africa. Kind of traditional religious beliefs that you would find in sub-Saharan Africa, although we don't have enough time to really go into many of them. Generally, we see that traditional religions believe that spirits inhabited the natural world, and that's usually reflected in art and religious practices and storytelling, or especially oral traditions in sub-Saharan Africa. But one thing that we see have a particular influence on Africa in the time leading up to the early modern age is Islam. Wherever trade goes, Islam goes. So North Africa had a heavy conversion to Islam. When the Trans-Saharan trade begins and connects North Africa with West Africa, Islam spreads. When the Swahili coast, or the east coast of Africa, begins trading in the Indian Ocean, especially with the Middle East, Islam will spread there as well. And so this spreading of Islam throughout Africa is still seen today in majority Muslim North and East Africa. Christianity will not yet have a major influence in Africa. Throughout this unit, we will see that along western coastal cities, Christianity will begin to make inroads. And Ethiopia, notwithstanding, is really the only Christian region of Africa in the pre-modern era. And we'll see that change over kind of the next 400 years of our course. But Islam has a very important impact on Africa, especially as a cause for and a result of trade. So that's it. We've looked at major events. We've looked at economics with trade. We've looked at politics. We've looked at culture. And here we have this image of the king of Mali, Mansa Musa, holding gold in his hand, showing his power of king with scepter in hand. And all these lines and cities shown on this map connecting trade between his powerful, rich empire and those around him, especially trading with North Africa. So this is kind of a nice little image that wraps up what we've been talking about in this video. If you have any questions, make sure to ask me in class or go back and rewatch. That's all, guys. You have a great day.